Hello everyone, my name is Bob Deacon. I'm an economist at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I'm part of the research team that has been looking at how the industry responded when individual fishing quotas were introduced in the West Coast Groundfish Fishery in January 2011. I'm reporting on joint research with another team member, Steve Miller, who will be making a separate presentation. Our focus is on looking at how individuals participating in this fishery responded to these individual fishing quotas, especially to the fishing quotas placed on so-called bycatch species, or overfish species that we're trying to avoid. I was supposed to put a slide of myself up front, but I decided not to and put a rockfish up there instead. So here is the obligatory slide. I also put some affiliations up on top. Putting Bycatch IFQs in place was something of a policy innovation. It's been done a few times elsewhere, but not very often. What it does is create an individualized penalty for catching these species that we're trying to protect. And it therefore creates strong avoidance incentives that apply to the individual at the individual level. The policies we've had in place before trying to control bycatch have imposed penalties on the entire fishery for behavior that took place at the entire fishery level. So we've had spatial closures, the rockfish conservation areas and essential fish habitat zones. We've also had hard caps on individual overfish species and then fishery-wide closures if those caps have been exceeded. But none of these imposed an individual penalty on someone who caused who took an individual action that caused bycatch to increase. So what we want to do is look at this new system, the individual IFQs for bycatch species, and see how that changed behavior. So the research question is posed there at the top of this slide. Some of the responses that we hypothesized people could take in trying to avoid bycatch, given these IFQs are in place, are listed below. Steve Miller is going to be talking mainly about spatial avoidance, in other words, just staying out of areas where these species are expected to be found. I'm going to be looking at other sorts of responses. One of them is just changes in the way that trawl gear is deployed, so shifts in fishing methods. Another will be shifts to more selective fishing gear. And a final one that I'll have just brief information on has to do with collective responses. And our goal really is to test the hypotheses that are up there in those bullet points. They're not stated as hypotheses, but we're really just testing to see if those kinds of adaptations occurred, and if they did, to try and estimate the strength of the response. The main data source that we're relying on this is a set of individual groundfish trawl logbook entries. We were given permission to examine essentially all of the trawl logbook entries in this fishery between 2005 to 2012. That's thousands of data points. In order to get access to this information, we had to agree to certain confidentiality conditions, which we have done. We put in place protocols to make sure that none of this data gets revealed. So these logbook entries, as anyone who is in the audience here who is a trawl fisherman knows, they provide extensive information on individual trawl sets, and so that's going to be our main data source for looking at whether or not behavior shifted following this IFQ program. We're going to combine that with some economic data on ex-vessel prices for individual fish that are landed at various ports, also economic data on input prices, fuel and labor. We'll be looking also at some auction prices for IFQ quota from the Jefferson State Trading Company, and we'll rely on some information from NOAA in a cost survey. A little later, I'll be talking about tests that rely on catch statistics, and then I'll give some descriptive information on collective actions from the California Risk Pool. So our the first adaptation that I'm going to look at has to do with a shift in trawl methods, in particular a shift in the time at which trawling takes place. There's evidence from the science literature that certain overfish species migrate up off the seafloor at night. while target species tend to stay on the bottom. So if you fish at night and you fish near the bottom, you might be able to avoid these bycatch events while still getting your targets. And the overfish species that are involved here are widow rockfish, and I think there's also evidence on yellow eye rockfish. We give some visual evidence here in this. This basically a distribution of the start times for trawl tows in the pre-IFQ period, which is the dashed lines, and the post-IFQ period, which is the solid line. You can see just from this graph, there's some indication that people shifted toward nighttime tow sets in the IFQ period, shifting away from their behavior in the pre-IFQ period. But that doesn't really answer the question that's of primary interest, and that's a causal question. Was this really linked to IFQs? So to get at that causal question, then we need to isolate the causal effect and control for any confounding factors. In other words, other kinds of factors that might have caused the same shift in the distribution. The model then looks at the outcome variable. We're looking at the nighttime fraction of tows on a given patch, and we're looking to see if it is different in the IFQ period than it was in the pre-IFQ period, and in particular if the shift toward nighttime fishing is especially high in patches where there's a big difference in the nighttime abundance versus the daytime abundance of these overfish species. So if IFQs really are driving this phenomenon, then what we expect to see is that when we shifted to IFQs, we found that there was a greater shift toward nighttime fishing in those patches where the difference between day and nighttime abundance is largest. And we structured an empirical model to tease out that effect. We're going to control for some other factors that might have been causing shifts in timing, and those are listed there in that second bullet point. But anyway, the result that we get is shown down in the bottom at just stated in words. By the way, anyone who's interested in looking at any of the details on this, and we do have a lot of details, we'd be happy to send a draft paper to you. Just contact us by email. So the result, under IFQs there was a shift toward nighttime fishing, and it was specifically in those areas where widow and yellow eye rockfish tend to be less abundant at night. So we do see that effect we're expecting, and that was a difference than, it was different behavior than what we were seeing in the pre-IFQ period. Now, the second adaptation we look at has to do with the duration of trawl tows, and here the idea is that if you make shorter trawl tows, then you're going to get higher frequency information on OFS concentrations. So if there are a lot of bycatch in the area that you happen to be trawling in, you'll find out about it sooner if you're making shorter trawl tows than if you were making longer tows. So on the basis of that, it could make sense to shorten the trawl tow just to make sure you don't have a huge bycatch event. And that would then be a sensible practice to follow in the IFQ period, but not necessarily in the pre-IFQ period, because prior to the IFQs there was no individualized penalty. Okay, so here we have a distribution of tow duration in hours in the pre-IFQ period, which is the dashed lines, and the post-IFQ period, which is the solid line. And you can see that the shift was, there was a shift toward shorter tows, and we're showing the means there as those vertical lines. The mean trawl duration was also significantly shorter in the post-IFQ period than it was before. But again, we want to tease out a causal effect. So to do that, we need to control for some confounding factors, and we need to sharpen our hypothesis. So what we hypothesize is that in those patches where your chance of catching overfish species is highly uncertain, so in those areas where you really don't have much information on how much bycatch you're likely to encounter, we'd expect that tow durations would be especially short in those areas in the IFQ period, but not prior to that. So we're looking for that kind of relatively nuanced effect. Now, we can actually tease out that effect using standard statistical techniques, and what we find is listed down there at the bottom under results, under IFQs, that is in the IFQ period, there was in fact a shift towards shorter tows, specifically in those areas where bycatch species abundance is highly variable. In other words, in areas where you don't have much information, we do see shorter tows in the IFQ period, but not in the pre-IFQ period. So this has all been information on effort, but we haven't said anything about catch yet, so let me just give some summary information on that. Here, the problem is that if we're looking at, we want to look at bycatch relative to the entire catch, or bycatch relative to target catch. And prior to the IFQ period, bycatch was routinely discarded, and so that makes it difficult to figure out what the catch actually was. However, there is a database that NOAA has developed from their observer program that provides estimates of bycatch discards in the pre-IFQ period. So it's a somewhat restricted data set, but it does give information on this. And we use that to address this question. So we basically looked at the bycatch fraction of the total trawl catch before and after IFQs, and found that after IFQs were introduced, the OFS, or bycatch fraction of total trawl catch, fell by over 40%. The next thing, and really the final quantitative exercise I want to go through, has to do with gear switching. It's well known that fixed gear, that is pots and traps and long lines, can be used more selectively than trawl gear. They can select on specific species more precisely than trawl gear can. Although we're finding out that trawl gear can also be more selective than we ever thought it was. So again, we want to look at a causal effect, see if there has been a shift from trawl to fixed gear after the OFS, the bycatch IFQs were introduced. We're going to use data in this case on catch statistics by gear type and by species and region, as well as time. And we're doing that because there aren't any logbooks to rely on for fixed gear vessels. So we're going to again try and estimate a hypothesis that will tease out a causal effect associated with bycatch IFQs. The outcome variable we're looking at is the trawl share of catch. In other words, what fraction of the catch was harvested with trawls as opposed to fixed gear. And we're going to look at data that vary across region and time. And we hypothesize that the bycatch share of trawl catch under IFQs is going to influence the overall share, bycatch share of trawl fishing. As indicated by that red bullet point down there, we expect that when the bycatch share of the trawl catch is high, then we'll see more shifting toward fixed gear. So in those circumstances where the bycatch share of trawling tends to be relatively high, we'll see more shifting toward fixed gear, and we expect that to occur under IFQs, but not in the pre-IFQ period. So we're controlling for some other variables here as well that are also listed in those other bullet points. Again, the details are in the paper, and we'd be happy to send that to you. But the summary result here is that under IFQs, there was in fact a shift away from trawl gear, and it occurred away from trawl gear and toward fixed gear, and it occurred specifically in regions and in time periods when trawl bycatch was high. So it does support that causal interpretation. Just some brief information on collective responses. Assigning individual quota for bycatch harvests created a new source of individual risk in the fishery, one that hadn't been present before, and really gave rise to a latent demand for a mutual insurance scheme. The idea is that if you have an accident, in this case, you could now be penalized, whereas that was not going to happen under the old regime. So fishermen could have benefited from being able to insure against those risks. The collective response we found in this case is the creation of risk pools, and that's what I'm going to talk about briefly here. The idea here is that a number of fishermen in this industry that own quota for overfished species could pool their quota together in order to spread risk, and it operates just like a mutual insurance scheme in the farming industry. Pool members would adopt rules for avoiding bycatch, and so long as you were obeying the rules, then the pool would cover you for a bycatch event. And these rules are typically called fishing plans. So we know that these fishing plans have been developed. The one risk pool that we had information on was the one that was formed jointly by fishermen in Morro Bay, based out of Morro Bay and based in Fort Bragg. They also, in addition to developing fishing plans, they also carried out, shared real-time information on bycatch concentrations. So they were able to avoid bycatch hotspots much more efficiently than they could have before. Just a summary result here. The risk pool's bycatch share of the groundfish catch was less than half the rate for the rest of the groundfish fleet. That's maybe not an entirely fair comparison, because I think they also had an abnormally high share of fixed gear as opposed to trawl gear. But nevertheless, it seems that they did were relatively effective at avoiding bycatch. And in addition, the risk pool managed to catch a higher percentage of its target species quota allocation than the rest of the fleet did. So just a few seconds here to wrap up the status of this project. We have a paper that reports the information I just summarized, as well as some information from on spatial avoidance that Steve is presenting. And we'd be happy to send that to you in draft form now or in finished form later on. We've also taken preliminary steps toward a descriptive paper about the risk pools. So that's all my presentation. Thank you very much for tuning into this, and I look forward to your questions.